Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And on this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, sport, and anything else we can think of. Today's guest, I'm delighted to have. He's a predominantly rugby writer. His name is Sam Peters. He's just written this book, Concussed, Sports Uncomfortable Truth, which has just been longlisted for the William Hill Sports Book of the Year Award. So congratulations on that. And thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Chris, and thank you very much. Yeah, that was a lovely start, I guess, hopefully, to recognition of the book. To be longlisted on that William Hill Prize is really exciting.
Oh, cool. Before we get into the crux of what your book is about, can you just let everyone know a little bit about yourself, who you are, who you've written for, and what led you to write the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, you've introduced me. So my name's Sam Peters, but I've spent just over 20 years covering professional sport, largely for national newspapers. Certainly for the first sort of 16, 17 years, I worked in the national newspaper industry. I was rugby correspondent at the Mail on Sunday for 5 years, and I worked for pretty much every national newspaper across the UK, and a number of regional ones as well. But really, my focus, as you rightly said, was on professional rugby, and really from an early point of covering the sport in the early 2000s, I'd played the game. I'd got injured playing the game, but I'd grown up loving the game and it being very much part of mine and my family's kind of DNA, really. But I was really shocked when I started covering the sport professionally as a journalist at the scale of the injuries that were being sustained, the extent and the severity of the injuries, and just how normalised severe injuries have become in the professional game. And probably bearing in mind that rugby union only turned professional in 1995, it was a very early stage of the development of the sport. And I just quite quickly started looking at what data there was around and available around that time around injuries, and it just didn't marry up with the picture I was seeing. And as I say, the extent of the injuries, lots of people refer to them as injuries they'd more normally associate in a car crash or road traffic accidents. And also head injuries being suffered routinely every single match, and in training, and players routinely being allowed to carry on playing even when they've been completely knocked out in some instances, which is a complete red flag. And but it was part of the culture at that time. So yeah, I started writing about it pretty much as soon as I became a journalist in rugby, and the concussion piece was almost a sort of natural evolution of my concern around injuries, and that really I started looking into much more seriously around 2012, 2013.
So obviously you've been involved with sport for a long time. So what was the rugby culture like in general before it became professional around the mid-90s?
Well, rugby's always been a tough sport, Chris. And it always will be, and it's always attracted people who enjoy physical contact, and it's always attracted people who enjoy the camaraderie of being part of a team and essentially, crossing the white line and recognising that you could get hurt. That's part of the attraction, no doubt. It was definitely part of the attraction for me when I played. You don't get the sort of level of adrenaline that you get when you take to the field in a sport where you could get seriously hurt. But I think where it went from a kind of jokey kind of amateur game where the top players would train 2 or 3 times a week, and there would be a lot more kind of light-hearted social side of things, let's say, that radically evolved in around 1995 post-professional to the guys training 5, 6, 7 days a week, obviously playing on at least 1 day a week, but often twice a week. And the coaches essentially having them under their watch for 8, 9, 10 hours a day. And the training was absolutely extreme in that time. I would argue it still is in some respects. And it sort of changed from being a game people played for fun to being a game that paid people's mortgages and paid for their very existence, really. So it became very serious very quickly. And I think I was noticing really early on that there was a lack of respect for player welfare. There was a kind of constant sense that in order to generate more money, the only answer ever was to play more games, and that came at a consequence. It was so obvious to me that was coming at a serious consequence to players' health, short, medium, and long term. I was obviously aware that in boxing, 1928, an American pathologist called Harrison Martland identified something called punch jump syndrome, dementia pugilistica, essentially a pathology which demonstrated that multiple repeated head injuries can lead to earlier dementias and neurological problems. And yeah, that to me was just being completely ignored, and also just the fact that players could get injured. They were heroes 1 minute, 24, 25 years old, then suffer a catastrophic injury, and people were just forgetting about them. I found it sort of fascinating, and also from a kind of moral perspective, I guess, troubling that you could sort of put someone on a pedestal 1 minute and everyone would be around them telling them how amazing they were and looking after them, and then the very next minute they were just forgotten about, and they were left to pick up the pieces with their families. And I thought that was profoundly wrong, and I also felt that as the sport grew, and the commercial side of it grew, then there should have been a much more support provided for players later on. So that was really the kind of picture I was seeing, and how things started to develop in my mind.
So obviously, when the sport became professional in the mid-90s, you're training more times a week, you're getting bigger, so that means any collisions you have are more pronounced. Was there anything tactically that was making those collisions pronounced as well?
Yeah, I mean, there was a shift towards a much more organised defensive system. So influx of rugby league coaches and players, former union players who've gone to league where you could get paid to play, but a lot came back. So far more organised defences, far more time being put into defensive training, and also far more time spent on the tackle technique, so which shifted radically. So again, talking about when I grew up playing in the 80s and early 1990s, mid 1990s, you were taught to essentially judo roll, use the momentum of the ball carrier to affect the tackle around the legs below the waist, and that, literally almost overnight, not quite overnight, but in a very, very short period of time, where the hits were being made on the body just changed, and you had the two-man tackle came in, which hadn't existed previously. Very, very dangerous, where you can essentially, one guy hits the knees or the legs, and the other simultaneously you're hitting high up the body to stop the offload, as the passing became known. Really significant change in the ways that tackles were affected, and they became a coming together of two opposing forces travelling at a velocity rather than a sort of passive act, just using that ball carrier's momentum. So that was a really, really significant change, and coupled with the organisation, you effectively had two lines spread across the pitch, one defensive, one attacking. So it resembled rugby league a lot more, and it resembled actually more American football as well. So yeah, that was a significant shift. And then allied to that, all these moves by the governing bodies to appease the television companies to make it a more attractive product, which was all about keeping the ball in play in time longer, speeding up the game in every sense. So not only were the hits bigger and more fierce, but they were also much more frequent and for a longer extended period of time. So you had all these forces at play, and then all the while it was very, very obvious to all of my colleagues, anybody who watched the sport for an extended period of time, that the game was getting more dangerous and the injuries was getting more severe. But at the same time, we were being told by senior doctors within the sport that we were wrong, or that I was wrong, or anyone who attempted to sort of say this is wrong, this has got too extreme, it's too dangerous, was shut down and told, you're looking in the wrong place, there's nothing to see here, and I pretty much refused.
You say your colleagues were seeing what was going on. How many of those colleagues in the media actually went public with it?
Well, lots of people wrote about rugby's changing injury profile. There's no, you couldn't avoid it, because certainly if you were covering England, what would happen every single major tournament or competition was that England would lose a truckload of players before the tournament because they were all beaten up and battered playing club rugby, and having had very little rest period between seasons. So it was part of the media narrative. Absolutely, it couldn't not be, but it didn't seem to me to be anything or any drive or moves to go, well, does it have to be like this? Does it have to be every time that there's a big international series? There are all these injuries happening beforehand, or couldn't we step back and go, well, what's the obvious thing that's causing all these injuries? It's exposure to more severe hits. I find it hard to work out a way to make the game less physical in that respect. You can't sort of take the genie back in the bottle in that regard. But what I definitely think you can do, and what you've always been able to do, is reduce players' exposure. And that means playing fewer games, training far less contact training, and just at every point trying to actually create a product, as it's now known, which is of a higher quality, but perhaps less of it. So I think rugby, just like so many sports, has reached saturation point. But the difference for rugby and the people who participate it at the top level is that has a very clear and direct consequence on their health. I think, I've worked alongside a lot, and I've covered a lot of cricket, for example. I've covered a lot of football, although less than cricket and rugby. And they're both sports which I think a lot of people would say there's just so much of it played now, it's just overwhelming. But, a fast bowler is going to have knee, ankle, back problems really predominantly. But rugby players are getting head injuries on to saturation point. So that's a very different proposition to me, and that's why I felt rugby needed to move more quickly than other sports, and that's what I argue in the book.
Is there a difference in regards to the health of rugby players after they retire, depending on country for country? And the reason I say that is because if you look at Ireland, they have the central contracts, more control of the players, and someone like England, which don't, although I've heard they're going to have these what called hybrid contracts. So is there a difference depending on the deals that each country has with its top players in effect in terms of the sport?
Absolutely. So, and that's something I write a lot about in the book, that there were two golden opportunities for England and English rugby to get their house in order when it came to looking after the top players. And that was 95, when the RFU chose to inexplicably call a moratorium on professionalism, when every other country just went for it, and the top unions just signed up their top players. And whereas England sat on their hands, and of course the clubs moved at that point and signed up the players. So you essentially had Premiership clubs and the RFU, which was England, almost competing against each other, and the players were the assets in the middle who were getting pulled around. Whereas centrally contracting them at that point would have given the RFU that degree of control to say, no, they can't play this week, they can play next week, they can't. Just that control. And then after England won the World Cup in 2003, Clive Woodward had negotiated a deal with Francis Barron, who's the chief executive of the RFU at that time. Basically, Woodward wanted central control of the players for all the reasons I've highlighted, partly player welfare, but partly for the success of the England team. And that Barron was ready to pay the money to make that happen, and various senior figures within, or certainly one senior figure, Simon Kemp, the RFU's head of medicine, was strongly of the view that it was okay, it was possible to manage players' workloads with hand in hand between the RFU and Premier Rugby, and therefore a fudge was created. Francis Barron put his checkbook away and saved the union a lot of money, but I would argue for the long-term health of the players, that, and also long-term success of the England rugby team, that was a disastrous moment.
Why did Simon Kemp decide it was a good idea that the clubs could actually manage the players as well as the RFU? Because that just seems bizarre, especially if it's a deal as well.
You'd have to ask him that question. I don't know. You could surmise that there was a financial element to this, of course. There was a Rugby Football Union is a commercial organisation, and to not have to spend money is helpful, but in the short term at least. But there was such a momentum behind English rugby at that point, having won the World Cup, so much goodwill towards English rugby, and so many players, people coming to the sport, whether that be players or investment. It just felt like that was a perfect opportunity missed. So I think, I'm sure things were done in good faith, but the long-term outcome has been, to me, very negative, and that was obviously the case at the time in Clive Woodward's eyes, and he resigned as a result.
I think one of the things reading the book that was actually heartening was when I think it was at the Mayo, and you had a sports editor there who was extremely helpful and allowed you to write about like what you wanted to say about concussion. How good was that, considering that a lot of people around you are saying, no, there's nothing to see here? How was it to be in that environment and actually write about the truth, essentially?
Yeah, it was really, really liberating. And I think what was so important, you're talking about Alison Curve in there, the first female sports editor on Fleet Street, essentially, was that there wasn't this obsession with celebrity. So it was very hard to get the really high profile guys to speak honestly about this, because they were so commercially tied. So although people like Lewis Moody, the former England captain, did eventually go on the record, and I was hugely grateful to him for doing that, it was understandably difficult for the top players to be really transparent about what was going on in the sort of injury side of things, and concussions. But so what that meant was that I needed to go and find people with less of a public profile who were more prepared to be honest, because essentially they had less to lose. But that meant, the big names as such weren't getting into the paper, or I wasn't writing so much about the big names. So it was really, that sort of cult of celebrity, which the tabloid newspaper world, and indeed we could argue, or social media and all the other elements of the media, we absolutely obsess about someone's profile, way more than actually what's the substance of what they're saying. So the news agenda gets completely distorted as a result, and non-stories get written about people just because they are big names, and really, really important stories get buried and lost just because the people telling them don't have a public profile. And that to me was completely crazy, deeply sort of challenging when it comes to things like democracy and just general news telling, and being a journalist. It was very tricky. We had to constantly be filing stories which were quotes driven. So someone who was high profile said pretty much nothing might get a page story in the paper, but as I say, people who were saying incredibly interesting, important things weren't getting heard. And so what Alison did by trusting me to go and find the story was to actually enable me to do that. And I think for the first time when I started writing about concussion, I actually genuinely felt like a journalist.
Okay. Obviously, you're highlighting what's happening in this country. You may or may not know this, but were there journalists abroad who you liaised with regards to that? And was the attitude towards concussions different abroad to what it was in England?
Yeah, so there were a number of journalists that I looked at their work and communicated with on a fairly regular basis. ESPN ran a series of very detailed stories and challenging stories about the NFL around 2012-13. So I spoke to some of their journalists. Chris Nowinski, who was not so much a journalist, but was writing a book, or wrote a book called Head Games, which was very important analysis essentially of what had happened in the NFL, and how the kind of corporate denial had played out in that country, and the resulting, in fact, lawsuit in 2013, which involved a massive payout to former American footballers who had suffered early onset dementia. There were various journalists in Australia I was speaking to on a fairly frequent basis, and it is interesting how certain countries seem to have sort of picked up the story, and it has been overlooked. I mean, France were definitely behind the curve in how they covered the story, but I think that's come right up to speed now. And there was a terrible case in 2019, where in fact it was sort of the bridge between 2018-19, where 4 rugby players died in the space of 12 months in France, all through contact, head-related, neck-related injuries. And I think that the French people really woke up to the conversation at that point. But yeah, I think social media enabled a lot of campaigners and a lot of journalists who thought this was a problem to sort of mobilise together. And I talk about the work of people like Dawn Astle, people like Peter Robinson, and also some of the journalists later on in the last few years, people like David Walsh, and other writers. There's been several books written about this subject. Hannah Walker-Brown's Delicate Game. Kieran Gill wrote an excellent book about football, dementia in football. So, there's much more focus on it now. It's much more of a mainstream conversation, whereas very much when I was writing about it and talking about it, it was very much on the sidelines.
One of the, again, going back to the book, which is an excellent book, by the way, but
thank you.
Initially sad parts of it, but funny parts because of certain incidents, is how you deal with directors of rugby when you start reporting this and going mainstream. Obviously, they weren't necessarily enlightened. You do mention a couple of incidents as well. The directors of rugby now, are they slightly more enlightened than they were back then, or is it just the same? Obviously, they've got to want to win for their teams, but are they a little bit more enlightened, a little bit more about player welfare than they were back then?
I think so. I mean, I'm much less at the coalface of rugby union now than I was 5 years ago. So that might be a question to ask a sort of current rugby journalist, as in who's treading the beat week in, week out. But certainly from what's being said publicly, and also I think seeing how well Harlequins performed a couple of seasons ago when they significantly reduced the amount of contact training and really tried to look after the players, and then obviously winning the Premiership. That was really encouraging. I think, cultures take a long-term time to change. And I think, rugby always has, even when it was amateur, has had this idea that you need to toughen up in training. You need to, if you're going backwards on a Saturday, you need to work, do more, basically beast yourself, or be beasted. But that just doesn't work anymore when it's 5 days, 6 days a week. It needs to be more scientific. It needs to be more sophisticated. I think whilst American football isn't the answer to everything, it's easily the most commercialized and sophisticated grown-up sport when it comes to this type of thing. And the fact that in American football, players will only play a maximum of 16 games a season, and that contact training has all but been eradicated during the season, banned essentially, and policed. That's really significant, and it hasn't in any way, as far as I can see, reduced the physicality of those games, reduced the enjoyment people get from watching those games. It's still a massively physical, confrontational sport, but where the guys just aren't getting beaten up during the week as well. And I think, it will take time for rugby union to realise that contact training is counterproductive. But yeah, the penny's taking longer to drop for some than others. And as you say in the book, I definitely clashed with a number of directors of rugby who are very influential people within clubs. A couple in particular who really didn't like being challenged and being called out for what I thought was inappropriate treatment of players. And yeah, those clashes are written about in the book.
Yeah, indeed they are. In regards to player welfare, obviously you have the PFA in football terms that deal with player welfare, and actually in regards to this, like they had a lot of stick in terms of the dimension football heading the balls. What about the rugby equivalent? What is their stance been on this? And have they been as stuck in the mud as the PFA has been in football?
Well, I've was a big supporter of the RPA, Rugby Players Association. When they were the obvious people I was going to support through this. I just found it increasingly difficult because essentially they are funded by the Rugby Football Union and Premier Rugby, the two organisations that employ their members. So I don't know how you sort of draw a comparison, but you can imagine the miners in 1970s, 1980s, their union being funded by the Conservative Party and Margaret Thatcher. I mean, it was just the weirdest setup. It was so conflicted and so obviously conflicted. Like the very people that the players needed protecting from, their employers were literally funding their union, their trade union. And it just became really obvious to me that whilst lip service was paid to player welfare and the RPA would sort of nod and agree that, yes, wring their hands and say this is outrageous, the reality was when push came to shove, they weren't prepared to dig their heels in. I was calling on the players to go on strike 5-6 years ago. That's when I think if they'd have done it then, they could have really got some traction. They needed to be prepared to take some flack, but it's a really difficult position that these guys are in because they're on short-term contracts, some of them outrageously short. There were all sorts of ways that clubs could terminate those contracts, essentially by lumping together injury periods, whereas and saying they've been injured for this amount of time when they were multiple injuries in one, and they just weren't protected properly. And I think that was exactly the same. The PFA, who I would argue is not as important an organisation as the RPA, even though it's extremely well funded, but clearly they buried their heads when it came to the head injury piece. I'm very critical of Gordon Taylor in the book, and the Jeff Astle case in around 2001, 2002 should have been pursued much more aggressively by the PFA, and I would argue the RPA made very, very similar failings by failing to pursue the concussion story, and actually through that concussion story affect and get their members benefits, which they should have had, and those benefits should have come in much bigger rest periods, much less contact training, and fewer exposures to games without affecting their salary. But I appreciate that many people in professional rugby would say that's the dream world, but we should have been aiming much higher than we were.
I just wonder, because you talk about Bloodgate in this book as well, and the impact of that. And one of the things you mention is the physio involved with that and what happened to her and the stress she was under. Has that changed the role of physio within rugby now? Because really they should be going by the Hippocratic Oath. They shouldn't be going by the clubs think, although the clubs are obviously paying their wages. So how has that relationship changed between what the physios and the doctors of a club want and what the directors of rugby want? Because there seems to be a massive conflict there.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is, and there sort of always will be, I suppose, Chris. And definitely I was seeing coaches, directors of rugby, verbally directing doctors and medics, making that you'd have a coach who obviously just wanted to win the game, being able to make a call on someone who'd suffered a brain injury on the pitch, whether they played on or not. And that to me made absolutely no sense at all. It doesn't make any sense to me now. There is more provision for independent doctors now, particularly at international level, and there have on very rare occasions been time where that independent doctor has overruled the match day doctors. And it's not about saying these are bad people at all. I think lots of amazing people work in medicine, in sport, but it's impossible to deny that conflict. Like, it's impossible to deny that tension isn't there between who am I serving? Is it the player? Is it just the player's health, or is it the player, their health and their ability to earn money in the future, or is it the player and the coach who just wants the players back faster? Like, it's an incredibly hard place to be, and that to me, I always suspected that dynamic was playing out, but I couldn't prove it as such, because how do you get inside a dressing room or inside a club, and get eyes on that sort of behaviour? But obviously what happened with Bloodgate was hugely revealing. And also, and for those listeners who don't know, just in very quick terms, the Bloodgate was a case where in rugby union you're allowed to substitute players off at that period of time if they had a blood injury. And essentially what became culturally normal, certainly in English rugby, was that fake blood was being brought onto the field, would you believe? And in this case, it was in the case of a capsule, a fake blood capsule bought from a toy shop or a joke shop a few days before. And the physio essentially giving it to the player, saying, bite into it, or words to that effect, do the right thing, I think in the Bloodgate case with Tom Williams. And then when the opposition twigged to the fact that it was a fake blood capsule, Leinster, quite rightly, cried foul. And then in that process, in order to try and pretend that it was a real blood injury, the Harlequins team doctor actually took the player into the change room and they used a scalpel to cut the inside of his mouth to create a fake injury. And this all came to light. Dean Richards was the coach of Harlequins at the time. It became clear that a lot of this was happening very much in his vision of, and in fact with his agreement, and that sort of the conversations then around how much influence doctors or how much influence directors of rugby had on team doctors and physios, to me became acutely important, and I really spent a lot of time looking at that. And then there was another incident in France in 2014. Guy Noves, who was at the time the Toulouse coach, was caught on video camera verbally abusing and forcing essentially his medical team to allow a player called Florian Fritz back onto the field, who had a horrendous head injury. He should have been in hospital, not back on a rugby field. Blood everywhere, major gash to his forehead, all the known symptoms of a brain injury, aggression, lack of balance. Or I mean, he just should never have been on a rugby field. But Noves insisted he went back on. He did go back on, and lo and behold, just a few years later, Noves was made the French national team coach, which to me wasn't indicative of a sport that was looking to root out that kind of behaviour. In many ways, it was rewarding that, which was very, very sad to see.
That's just crazy. I mean, again, go back to the book. There's a few instances where you say someone's had a tackle or someone's come from the bottom of a pile and are just wandering all over the place, clear concussed. And what's shocking to me is when you quote some of what the pundits talk about and what the commentators say, oh, it's all right, they should be on the field. And I'm thinking, they're clearly concussed. I mean, it's happened a couple of times in football, but in rugby, when I've seen it, they're clearly concussed. And I'm just thinking, why? Okay, it's one thing where clubs and the clubs are doing it, which I don't condone, but you can say they're at least trying to win. But when you have pundits and commentators who have no stake in which side wins or loses or shouldn't, I just think, why didn't they call out on it and say, actually, it's not right, just take the player off?
Well, I mean, some of us did, and I definitely think more and more do now. And there was it's really important to remember, Chris, that we were being told as journalists there isn't a problem here. The doctors were telling us there isn't a problem, and in some instances it was clear the doctors themselves found it quite amusing as an injury, and so we are, as sports journalists, you are bound to a degree to listen to the experts, and that's entirely reasonable. But what I ended up doing was going outside of the experts in sport and going to the experts in brain injury and going to various hospitals, listening to presentations around repetitive head injuries, listening to the neuropathologists, the neurologists, the people who their interest wasn't vested in sport, it was vested in medicine and looking after people. And that's when I started to think there's a really big problem, and I don't really believe what's being said in sport. I don't believe that there was no long-term causal link between repetitive head injuries and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which was this rebranded punch-drunk syndrome, which was found in many American footballers and continues to be found once they're deceased. So yeah, I think there was it was really difficult to cut through to the truth, and cut through to the reality. And it was only really by stepping away from the kind of high profile international glamorous side of the game, which was, very alluring without a shadow of a doubt. But it was only by stepping away from that, getting away from the cult of celebrity, listening to people who weren't conflicted, and then making some more rational judgments, and being able to talk about it with a degree of education, and being able to push back against some really quite senior and very influential people in the game.
Do you think the guidelines around concussion are tight enough now? And I say that in light of the ban that Owen Farrell should have received for the World Cup, where he was just lawyers were able to basically overturn that ban, which to me sounds crazy. Like that you could, regardless of his concussion or that, you can actually do that on the field of play. It seems to me that those guidelines around concussion just aren't tight enough, neither morally nor legally.
Yeah, I think they are far better than they were, far better than 10 years ago, without any shadow of a doubt. There's so much more awareness of the issue in the sport. There's a clear move towards reducing head-to-head collisions on the pitch, which you just described with the Farrell case. What I'm reassured about is that when cases like that happen that are so obviously badly handled, there has been a really significant public outcry, and I think that was part of what happened. It's unfortunate for Farrell that it did become a sort of trial by social media, but in a way, everything is now in that respect. Like the video, people are going to study videos. They don't just get one look at it, or if the broadcaster chooses not to show it, they don't get to see it properly. Like the analysis is happening on a much more kind of macro scale. And so, yeah, that incident was a very, very bad look for professional rugby. But I think that the groundswell of opinion, although there was obviously some fairly predictable voices that said it's fine, there's nothing wrong with it. Clearly there isn't an appetite from the public to see lots and lots and lots of players getting knocked out and suffering brain injuries all the time. What I would say, so I think that has moved in the right direction. Reducing the tackle height is a move in the right direction. Really strictly policing the head injury assessment is basically a good thing. It's better than nothing, definitely. But I also have said time after time after time that it shouldn't all come onto the players. It shouldn't all be about changing behaviours on the pitch, although it's really clear, I think, from this World Cup already that the best teams are the ones that have adapted to that tackle trial most effectively. The South Africa-Ireland game, I think, earlier in the tournament was just unbelievable in terms of its physicality, but there wasn't a high hit in the whole game, which was great, just how it should be. But yeah, I think going back to kind of what I was saying before, the systemic piece is about reducing games, reducing exposure to contact training, and therefore reducing overall exposures to head injuries. The stuff that's going on in the matches is it's quite important, but I don't think it's by any means the most important part of this.
When this CET was discovered in American footballers, and you had some past American footballers and their families suing the NFL, and there was obviously a settlement. You've seen similar moves being made in rugby, both union and league. What's the latest on that? And do you think there may be a case here, or should be a case for the RFU to say, okay, not just RFU actually, World Rugby to say, okay, this lawsuit's happened, even if it's for financial reasons, okay, we'll put something in place now so that this doesn't happen again with regards to concussion?
Yeah, I think, well, where's the legal case at now? I'm not entirely sure in terms of, I've had some contact with Rylands. I've given them my testimony as such, as in the book is my testimony. And I've spoken to them various times around my experiences and what I saw happening. I think it's probable that it will get to a point where it's settled out of court, because I wouldn't have thought the RFU really want this gone through in absolute minute detail. If it did go to court, I would, I would of course give the evidence if I was called upon. And as I say, what I've written in the book is pretty much my story of what I saw, and whether that gets to court and it's found that the RFU are liable of breaches of player welfare that have caused long-term damage, then that's not for me to decide, obviously. But I think unquestionably a long-term fund for players similar to the one that the PFA announced recently, although it's going to have to be much more significant than that, and invested in, I think, by every stakeholder in sport, professional rugby, whether that be the players themselves, who are given informed choice or should be given informed choice about the risks involved, the unions, the national governing bodies, Premier Rugby in the English case, the professional clubs, and sponsors and television. Anyone who is there to make a commercial gain out of the sport has to, in my mind, recognise that there is a cost, and it's so now undeniable that cost is severe in some cases. Players being diagnosed with early onset dementia in their early 40s or late 30s is completely unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. So what are we going to do about it?
We've talked about CET. Is it similar with motor neuron disease? Is it rugby players tend to get, in terms of regard, compared to the general population, get diagnosed with motor neuron disease a lot more because of the collisions as well?
There's higher incidence of all those neurodegenerative illnesses, Parkinson's, motor neuron disease, other dementias, other neurodegenerative problems. There's also evidence, the World Rugby's own research has shown that rugby players have poorer mental health outcomes and later in life. That's evidence that's been published by World Rugby, although it's presented in a very different way. The Drake Foundation have funded independent research, which again found significant evidence of brain damage to players early in their professional careers. And again, that evidence or the research was suppressed. It wasn't presented in a way that it should have been. In some cases, it still isn't being presented in a way that it should have been. And the power that the governing bodies have in funding the research and controlling the narrative around that research, controlling the data, is not to be ignored. And I certainly didn't ignore it. So yeah, there's a lot of evidence there to show that this is a significant problem. And sadly, the higher profile cases of motor neuron disease, which we're seeing in rugby now, and have seen over the last few years, starting with Joos van der Westhuizen, although only perhaps in the public consciousness, he definitely wasn't the first case. But it's a really challenging issue for the sport, because on the one hand, a young player might get diagnosed with a terrible illness such as that, which there is a reasonable possibility, let's say, was caused at least in part by all the head injuries they suffered during their playing career. And then at that point, there's a sort of coming together of the rugby family, people involved in the sport who obviously want to look after this person and their family. But at the same time, there's the elephant in the room, which is, well, why has he got it? And that's a really difficult conversation for people to have. And, the individual themselves doesn't want to say, I think rugby caused this. Joos van der Westhuizen, I asked him that question directly before he died, about a year before he died. And he sort of laughed and said, if it did, I'd still do it again. And that's okay, that's fine. That would be a choice that every individual has that right to make. But my point is that these sort of things were never being flagged up as risks. In fact, whenever I suggested there may be a higher instance of motor neuron disease in former professional rugby players, it got no traction. People just didn't want to hear it. And as I said, the more evidence I saw, the more research I did, the more I understood the picture, and the more important I felt it was that this story needed telling. And I got a lot of pushback, and continue to in some respects, and got a lot of found myself in a lot of confrontations. But I have and always will believe that I've done the right thing here in pushing this further up the agenda of the media agenda. And it's not for me really to then go, well, this is exactly what rugby needs to do. It's like, this is the story, this is that I'm telling you. And now it's, over to rugby and sort of public kind of tolerance of injury and damage to the participants to come up with a response, I suppose.
Well, Sam, as I said, it's an excellent book. It's been brilliant to speak to you, and that's your finances a really good point to end on. If people want to read not just your work, but also any work regarding concussion in rugby and other sports, where would be the best places to look?
Well, there's a website that we've set up called concuss.media, and that's where all the coverage that the concussion book the concussed book has generated, lots of information. We've also got various events coming up, Chris. We ran a launch event just last week, which former England hooker Steve Thompson and Wales number 8 Alex Popham joined me on stage down here near Tisbury, where I live in Wiltshire, which was a fantastic event. We had 75 people. Venue was sold out, and we're looking at doing a number of further events in the future. I'm going to be in Bath at Toppings on November the 2nd, and we're going to be doing an event in London in partnership with British Land, all being well, towards the end of November, which will be a 200 ticket event. So there's lots more to come. I'm going to keep talking about this issue. I think it's really important. I'm really grateful to you, Chris, for inviting me on and to giving me the chance to tell your audience my story. And yeah, if people were up for going to buy the book off the back of this, hopefully they'll find a very well researched, I hope it's a very well researched book that has a narrative thread, a beginning, a middle and an end. Some happy stories and lots of sad ones, but it is an uncomfortable story to tell and an uncomfortable story to read. But hopefully your viewers and audience agree it's a worthwhile story to tell.
I'll leave the details of Concuss.media website in the description below. Sam Peters, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Likewise, Chris, thank you so much for inviting me on. I really am very grateful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care.